I'm Victoria, 29, and 3 days before my wedding, I made a decision that saved my entire empire. I secretly transferred my $16.9 million tech company into a trust, hiding it from my fiancé Derek and his money-hungry family. When his mother Patricia showed up to my bridal suite with a notary and legal documents demanding I sign over half my assets, I knew my instincts had been right. What followed was the most satisfying takedown of a gold-digging family you've ever heard, and the revenge. Let's just say they thought they were getting millions but ended up with nothing except a front-row seat to their own humiliation. What do you think happened when I revealed the truth about my hidden company? Drop your predictions below. If you love stories where smart women outsmart greedy families, hit that like button and subscribe because this wedding day revenge will leave you cheering. The way this family's greed backfired is absolutely perfect. My journey to becoming a multimillionaire started in my tiny studio apartment 4 years ago, fueled by nothing but determination and a laptop I'd bought with my last $800. While my friends were going out to bars and posting Instagram stories about their weekend adventures, I was coding until 3 a.m., building what would eventually become VirtuLearn, an AI-powered educational platform that revolutionized how companies train their employees. The early days were brutal. I lived on ramen noodles and black coffee, slept 4 hours a night, and turned down every social invitation for 18 months straight. My family thought I was wasting my business degree on computer stuff, and even my closest friends started calling me less frequently because I was always working. But I had a vision that kept me going through the exhaustion and isolation. The breakthrough came when TechCorp, a Fortune 500 company, agreed to pilot my platform for their employee training program. Within 6 months, their training efficiency improved by 340%, and word spread through corporate networks like wildfire. Suddenly, companies were calling me instead of the other way around, and the revenue started growing exponentially. By year 2, VirtuLearn was generating $2.3 million annually. By year 3, we'd hit $8.7 million. And by the time I turned 29, just 6 months before my planned wedding, my company was valued at $16.9 million with clients across 3 continents and a waiting list of companies desperate to implement our technology. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about sudden wealth: it changes how everyone around you behaves, often in ways that reveal their true character. The moment word got out about my success, I started noticing shifts in relationships that made me deeply uncomfortable. My fiancé Derek, whom I'd been dating for 2 years before the company took off, suddenly became much more interested in wedding planning. He'd previously been content with a small ceremony and simple reception, but now he was pushing for elaborate venues, expensive photographers, and a guest list that seemed to grow weekly. "We can afford it now," became his favorite phrase, even though he'd contributed exactly $0 to my company's success. Derek's family, the Washingtons, transformed from politely distant to aggressively involved in our relationship. His mother Patricia, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for the first year we dated, was suddenly calling me weekly with helpful suggestions about everything from wedding venues to where Derek and I should buy our first house together. His father Robert started making comments about family investments and how my company could benefit from experienced guidance. The red flags weren't subtle. During family dinners, Derek's parents would steer conversations toward my business, asking detailed questions about revenue, profit margins, and growth projections. Patricia would make comments like, "It's so wonderful that Derek will be able to help you manage all this success," despite the fact that Derek worked in sales for a mid-tier insurance company and knew nothing about technology or business management. Most troubling was Derek's attitude toward my money. He'd started making assumptions about our future that felt presumptuous and entitled. He talked about our company, our assets, and our financial planning as if my years of sacrifice and hard work had somehow become joint property the moment we got engaged. The breaking point came during a family dinner 6 months before the wedding, when Robert casually mentioned that he'd spoken to a financial advisor about the best ways to structure Derek and Victoria's combined assets for tax purposes. When I asked what he meant, he explained that he'd taken the liberty of researching how married couples typically merge their business interests for optimal financial efficiency. "I didn't ask for financial advice," I said carefully. And Derek and I haven't discussed merging any business interests. Patricia jumped in with a laugh that sounded forced. Oh, Victoria, don't be silly. When you're family, these things need to be planned properly. Derek's going to be your husband, of course you'll want to protect both of your interests. That night, Derek and I had our first serious fight about money. He accused me of being secretive and controlling about my business, while I tried to explain that I'd built Virtulearn before we were even engaged and wasn't ready to restructure everything just because we were getting married. It feels like you don't trust me, Derek said, and something in his tone made me realize that he might be right. Not because he'd done anything overtly wrong, but because his entire family's sudden interest in my financial situation felt predatory rather than protective. That's when I made the decision that would save my entire future. I called my lawyer the next morning and started the process of creating an irrevocable trust that would protect Virtulearn from any potential claims during or after marriage. The paperwork was complex and had to be done carefully to ensure it would hold up under legal scrutiny, but within 3 months, my company was completely shielded from any marital property claims. I didn't tell Derek about the trust. Something in my gut told me that the information would somehow make its way back to his parents, and I wanted to see how the wedding planning process unfolded without them knowing that their presumed access to my wealth was an illusion. What I discovered over the next few months confirmed my worst fears about their true intentions and set the stage for the most satisfying wedding day revenge in history. Once the trust was established and my company was legally protected, I became a very interested observer of how Derek and his family behaved during wedding planning. What I witnessed was a masterclass in financial manipulation disguised as family enthusiasm, and every conversation reinforced my decision to hide my assets. Patricia appointed herself as the unofficial wedding coordinator, despite the fact that I'd already hired a professional planner. She had strong opinions about everything, but her suggestions always seemed to involve the most expensive options available. The $15,000 flowers instead of the $3,000 arrangement I'd chosen. The $8,000 photographer instead of the perfectly capable $4,000 option. The $25,000 reception venue instead of the charming $12,000 location I'd originally selected. Victoria, darling, she'd say with that fake maternal tone that made my skin crawl, this is your special day. You don't want to look back and regret cutting corners. Besides, you can afford the best now. When I pushed back on the inflated costs, Derek would side with his mother. Mom's right, Vic. We can afford it, and she has great taste. Why not go with the nicer options? But here's what really bothered me. None of them had offered to contribute financially to any of these expensive upgrades they were so enthusiastic about. It was easy to have expensive taste when you assumed someone else would be paying for it. The most revealing moment came during a dress shopping trip that Patricia had insisted on attending. I'd found a beautiful dress for $2,800 that I absolutely loved, but Patricia kept steering me toward gowns in the $8,000 to $12,000 range. This one is exquisite, she gushed, holding up a dress that cost more than some people's cars. Derek would be so proud to see you walking down the aisle in something truly special. When I tried to explain that I preferred the less expensive option, Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment. Victoria, I know you're used to being frugal, but you're marrying into the Washington family now. We have a certain standard to maintain. The implication was clear. My money was expected to fund their family's standards, while they maintained their position as arbiters of how that money should be spent. Derek's behavior was equally troubling, but in more subtle ways. He'd started making comments about our future that assumed I'd be scaling back my business involvement once we were married. He talked about the big house we'd buy together and the expensive vacations we'd take, but when I asked how we'd afford these luxuries on his insurance sales salary, he'd laugh and say, "Come on, Vic, your company generates more in a month than I make in a year." The possessive language was everywhere. Our company, our money, our financial future. Derek had somehow convinced himself that my years of sacrifice and hard work had earned him an equal stake in my success simply by virtue of being my fiancé. But the most disturbing discovery came 3 months before the wedding, when Derek casually mentioned that his father had helped him research prenuptial agreements. According to Robert's research, they'd concluded that a prenup would be insulting and unnecessary given how much Derek would be contributing to our shared success. Contributing how? I asked, genuinely curious what Derek thought he'd be bringing to my established, profitable company. Well, emotional support, business advice, networking opportunities through my family's connections, Derek said, as if these vague concepts justified an equal claim to my assets. That conversation sent me straight back to my lawyer to make sure the trust was ironclad. We added additional layers of protection and created documentation that would make it impossible for anyone to claim I'd hidden assets fraudulently. Everything was legitimate, legal, and designed to protect what I'd earned through my own efforts. The final red flag came 2 weeks before the wedding, when Patricia suggested we have a family meeting to discuss financial planning for the newlyweds. She'd invited Robert's brother, who was a financial advisor, and wanted to review the best strategies for combining assets and optimizing tax structures for high-net-worth couples. I think we should wait until after the honeymoon to worry about financial planning, I said diplomatically. Patricia's response was telling. Oh, Victoria, these things are so much easier to sort out before the marriage is official. Once you're legally married, the paperwork becomes more complicated. In other words, she wanted to restructure my assets while I was still legally single and potentially more vulnerable to pressure. The predatory nature of her suggestion was barely disguised as helpfulness. That night, I made a decision that would ultimately save my entire future. I called my lawyer and arranged for additional documentation that would make my financial independence unquestionable. If Derek's family was planning some kind of financial ambush, I wanted to be completely prepared. What I didn't expect was how brazen their attempt would be, or how perfectly my preparations would position me to deliver the most satisfying revenge of my life. 2 days before the wedding, Patricia called with an urgent request that should have been my final warning about what was coming. She needed to stop by my bridal suite to help with some last-minute paperwork that apparently couldn't wait until after the honeymoon. Her tone was overly casual, but something about the timing felt ominous. What kind of paperwork? I asked, though I already suspected I knew where this was heading. Oh, just some financial documents that Robert thinks would be smart to handle before the ceremony. You know how he worries about making sure everything is properly organized for you kids. The fact that Robert was worried about my financial organization when he'd never shown any interest in my business before was laughable. But I agreed to the meeting, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to push their agenda. Patricia arrived at my hotel suite the next morning with Robert, Derek's uncle Marcus, the financial advisor, and a woman I didn't recognize who was carrying a leather briefcase and a notary stamp. The delegation looked like they were preparing for a hostile corporate takeover, not a friendly family chat about financial planning. Victoria, darling, Patricia said, kissing my cheek with fake warmth, we brought some paperwork that will make your life so much easier once you and Derek are married. Marcus has put together the most wonderful financial structure that will protect both of you. Marcus spread documents across my coffee table like he was dealing cards, and what I saw made my blood pressure spike immediately. Contracts for restructuring my business as a marital asset. Documents transferring partial ownership of Vertulern to Derek. Investment agreements that would give Robert advisory control over major business decisions. And a post-nuptial agreement that essentially split my company's value 50-50 between Derek and me. This is quite a lot of paperwork for a casual meeting, I said, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced. Robert jumped in with his practiced sales pitch. Victoria, we know this seems overwhelming, but these documents will protect you from so many potential legal and tax complications down the road. The way your business is currently structured leaves you vulnerable to all sorts of issues that could cost you millions in the long run. What kind of issues? I asked, though I was pretty sure Robert had no idea what he was talking about. Well, tax liability, partnership disputes, investment opportunities that require spousal consent, Marcus said, rattling off vague concerns that sounded impressive but made no actual sense given my company's structure. Patricia moved closer, placing her hand on my arm in a gesture that was probably meant to be motherly but felt manipulative. The most important thing is making sure Derek has legal standing to help you if anything happens to the business. Right now, if you got sick or had an accident, he'd have no authority to make decisions about your company. These documents fix that problem. The audacity was breathtaking. They were presenting documents that would essentially hand over half my life's work to Derek as protection for me. And they'd brought a notary to ensure I could sign everything immediately, before I had time to think or consult my own lawyer. I appreciate the thought, I said carefully, but I'm not comfortable signing any financial documents without having my lawyer review them first. The temperature in the room shifted immediately. Patricia's smile became strained, Robert's jaw tightened, and Marcus started shuffling papers like he was preparing to pack up. Victoria, Robert said in a tone that was supposed to sound reasonable but came across as condescending, these are standard documents that any high-net-worth couple would sign. There's nothing unusual or concerning about any of this. Then you won't mind if I take a few days to have them reviewed properly. Well, the timing is important, Patricia said, her voice rising slightly. Some of these structures need to be in place before the marriage is official, or they become much more complicated to implement. That's when Derek's uncle Marcus played what they probably thought was their ace card. Victoria, I have to be honest with you. Derek is concerned that you're being unnecessarily secretive about your finances. He's worried that you don't trust him enough to share important decisions about your future together. The emotional manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. They were trying to make my reluctance to hand over half my company seem like a character flaw rather than basic common sense. Where is Derek? I asked. If he's concerned about our financial planning, shouldn't he be part of this conversation? Patricia and Robert exchanged a glance that told me everything I needed to know. Derek wasn't here because they knew this conversation would be easier without him. They were counting on family pressure and last-minute wedding stress to push me into signing documents that would benefit them more than anyone else. Derek's handling some last-minute groomsmen issues, Patricia said vaguely. But he's completely supportive of everything we're discussing today. The notary, who'd been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. I do need to mention that these documents are quite extensive. In my professional experience, most people prefer to review complex financial agreements with their own legal counsel before signing. Patricia shot the notary a look that could have melted steel. That's why we brought Marcus. He's family, and he's a licensed financial advisor. Victoria doesn't need to pay for expensive legal fees when we have expertise right here. That's when I made the decision that would set up the most satisfying revenge of my life. Instead of continuing to deflect and delay, I decided to let them think they were making progress while I prepared my counterattack. You know what? I said, putting on my best grateful smile. You're right. Derek and I are going to be family, and I should trust his family's advice. Let me just read through these documents carefully, and we can discuss signing them tomorrow morning before the ceremony. The relief on their faces was immediate and telling. They thought they'd won. They thought one more day of pressure and manipulation would get them exactly what they wanted. They had no idea that I was about to deliver a lesson in financial warfare that would leave them stunned, humiliated, and completely empty-handed. That evening, while Derek's family was probably celebrating their presumed victory over my financial independence, I was on a conference call with my lawyer, my accountant, and the trust administrator, putting the finishing touches on what would become the most satisfying business presentation of my life. Every document they'd tried to pressure me into signing was worthless, and I was about to prove it in the most dramatic way possible. The irrevocable trust is completely bulletproof, my lawyer confirmed. Vertulern is owned by the trust, not by you personally. You're the beneficiary and the designated manager, but legally, you don't own assets that can be subject to marital property claims. And the documentation is sufficient to prove this was established before any marital arrangements? I asked, wanting to be absolutely certain. More than sufficient. We have bank records, notarized documents, and filing receipts that clearly show the trust was established 8 months ago, long before any engagement or wedding planning began. There's no way anyone could claim this was done to hide marital assets. My accountant added the final piece of reassurance: the tax implications are clean, the corporate structure is legitimate, and the business operations haven't been affected at all. From every legal and financial perspective, this is exactly how high-net-worth individuals should protect their assets. As I reviewed the timeline, I realized how perfectly everything had aligned. Derek's family's increasing financial interest in my business had started around the same time I'd begun the trust process. Their aggressive wedding planning push had coincided with my asset protection measures. And their last-minute legal documents offensive was happening just as my trust documentation was becoming unassailable. It was like they'd been planning a heist while I was building a vault, and neither side had known what the other was doing. The next morning, I arrived at the bridal suite early and set up my own presentation area with documents that would completely destroy their carefully planned financial ambush. When Patricia knocked on my door at exactly 9 a.m., accompanied by the same delegation as the day before plus Derek this time, I was ready with a surprise that would turn their world upside down. "Good morning, everyone," I said with genuine warmth. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have some documents of my own to share before we discuss any financial planning." Derek looked confused but optimistic. "Vic, I'm glad you're being more open about this stuff. My family really just wants to help us start our marriage on the right foot." "I know," I replied, setting up my laptop and pulling out a folder full of legal documents. "And I want to be completely transparent about our financial situation. In fact, I think it's time I shared some information about my business structure that will probably surprise everyone." Patricia was practically vibrating with anticipation. She probably thought I was about to reveal additional assets or investment opportunities that would make their takeover even more profitable. "The thing is," I continued, pulling up my first document on the laptop screen, "Vertulearn isn't actually structured the way most people assume. 8 months ago, I transferred ownership of the company into an irrevocable trust." The silence in the room was immediate and complete. Derek looked confused, Marcus looked concerned, and Patricia looked like she was trying to process information that didn't compute with her expectations. "What does that mean exactly?" Derek asked, and for the first time in months, his question sounded genuine rather than acquisitive. "It means I don't technically own Vertulearn anymore," I explained, pulling up the trust documents. "The company is owned by the trust, which exists as a separate legal entity. I'm the primary beneficiary and the designated manager, but the assets themselves are protected from any personal legal or financial claims." Robert found his voice first. "Victoria, that seems like an unnecessarily complicated structure. Why would you do something like that?" "Asset protection," I said simply. "When you have a valuable business, it's standard practice to protect it from potential lawsuits, creditor claims, or other financial risks. My lawyer recommended this structure to ensure the company would be safe regardless of what happens in my personal life." Marcus was frantically flipping through the documents they'd brought, and I could see him starting to understand the implications. "So the documents we prepared yesterday, they wouldn't actually accomplish what we discussed?" "That's correct," I confirmed, enjoying the growing panic on their faces. "Since I don't personally own the assets you're trying to restructure, I can't transfer ownership or control to Derek through a marital agreement. The trust owns everything, and the trust exists independently of my marital status." Patricia's carefully maintained composure was starting to crack. "But surely there are ways to modify the trust structure after marriage? There must be legal mechanisms for including Derek in the business ownership?" "Actually, that's the beauty of an irrevocable trust," I said, pulling up the relevant legal language. "It can't be modified, dissolved, or restructured without meeting very specific legal criteria that definitely don't include getting married. The whole point is that it's permanent and protected." Derek was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Vic, when did you do this? Why didn't you tell me you were changing how your business was structured?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the conversation where I'd have to decide whether to preserve his dignity or tell the complete truth about why I'd felt the need to protect my assets from his family. "I started the process 8 months ago, right around the time your family became very interested in my financial planning," I said diplomatically. It seemed like a prudent business decision given the company's growth and value. The timeline implications weren't lost on anyone in the room. 8 months ago was exactly when Patricia had started her aggressive wedding planning involvement and Robert had begun his financial advisory suggestions. So all of this, Robert said, gesturing toward the stack of documents on the table, is completely pointless. Well, not pointless, I replied. It's been very educational. I've learned a lot about everyone's expectations and priorities when it comes to my financial success. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was heavy with the weight of exposed intentions and shattered assumptions. They'd spent months planning how to gain control of assets that were legally beyond their reach, and they'd just discovered that their entire strategy had been based on incorrect information. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more revelation that would complete their humiliation and make my victory absolute. The morning of my wedding, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. For months, I'd been dreading this day because of the family dynamics and financial pressure surrounding it. But now, armed with the truth about Derek's family's intentions and the security of knowing my assets were protected, I felt something unexpected, excitement about finally taking control of my own narrative. Derek had spent the previous evening in damage control mode after learning about the trust, trying to convince me that his family's financial planning ambush had been well-intentioned rather than predatory. But his arguments felt hollow when weighed against months of increasingly aggressive behavior from Patricia and Robert. "Vic, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he'd said during our awkward conversation the night before. "My parents weren't trying to take control of your business. They were trying to protect both of us." "Protect us from what, Derek?" "From complications. Legal issues. Tax problems. The kinds of things that could hurt us down the road. And they needed to do this without consulting my lawyer or giving me time to review the documents because..." Derek had struggled to answer that question in a way that made his family's behavior seem reasonable, and his inability to defend their actions told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd been complicit in their planning. As I got ready for the ceremony, I realized that the morning's events had given me a perfect opportunity to make a clean break from people who saw my success as their opportunity rather than my achievement. The wedding could proceed, but the relationship dynamics would be forever changed now that everyone knew where they actually stood. Patricia arrived at my bridal suite 2 hours before the ceremony, ostensibly to help with final preparations but actually to attempt one last manipulation. She'd clearly spent the night strategizing how to salvage their financial ambitions despite the trust revelation. "Victoria, darling," she said, watching my makeup artist apply final touches, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize we may have come across as pushy about the financial planning. That wasn't our intention at all. I appreciate that, Patricia. The thing is, Robert and I have been talking, and we think there might be other ways to structure things that would benefit everyone. Maybe we could discuss some partnership opportunities between Derek and your company? Or investment strategies that would help you maximize the trust's benefits?" The woman was relentless. Even after discovering that she couldn't gain control of my assets through marriage, she was still looking for angles to get her hands on my money. Her persistence would have been admirable if it weren't so transparently greedy. "Patricia, I think it's best if we keep business and family relationships separate going forward. My company has professional advisors and established strategies that work well for our situation." Her smile became strained. "Of course, dear. I just want to make sure Derek feels included in your financial decisions as your husband. Marriage is about sharing everything, after all. Some things, yes. Business operations that existed before the marriage, probably not." That's when Derek arrived with news that would provide the perfect ending to this entire situation. He looked stressed and uncomfortable, and when he asked to speak with me privately, I could tell he had something significant to say. "Vic, we need to talk about something before the ceremony," he said once we were alone. "I've been thinking about everything that happened yesterday, and I think maybe we should postpone the wedding." I felt a wave of relief so strong it was almost physical. "Really? Why?" "Because I realize I don't actually know you as well as I thought I did. The trust thing, the way you handled my family's suggestions, the fact that you made major financial decisions without discussing them with me, it makes me wonder if we're ready for marriage. Derek was giving me the perfect exit from a relationship that had been compromised by his family's greed and his own entitlement to my success. But instead of simply agreeing with his suggestion, I decided to use this moment to deliver one final lesson about assumptions and consequences. Derek, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. When you started talking about our company and our money and our financial future, did you ever consider that those things weren't actually ours? That they were mine, that I'd earned them before we were even engaged, and that you hadn't contributed anything to building that success? Derek looked genuinely surprised by the question. Well, I thought that when people got married, they shared everything. Isn't that how marriage works? Sharing is different from assuming. Your family spent months planning how to gain control of assets I'd earned independently, and you supported their efforts instead of defending my right to make my own financial decisions. That doesn't feel like partnership, it feels like acquisition. The conversation that followed was surprisingly civil but absolutely definitive. Derek admitted that his family's excitement about our marriage had been largely financial, and that he'd gotten caught up in their assumptions about gaining access to my wealth. I acknowledged that I'd hidden the trust formation because their behavior had made me feel like I needed to protect my assets from their ambitions. We agreed that postponing the wedding was the right decision, but I had one more surprise that would make this the most satisfying conclusion possible. Derek, since we've already paid for the venue, the flowers, the catering, and everything else, I think we should go ahead with the reception. Not as a wedding celebration, but as a party to celebrate my company's success and my decision to prioritize my own financial independence. The look on his face was priceless, part confusion, part admiration, and part realization that he'd underestimated me from the beginning. You want to throw yourself a business success party instead of a wedding? Why not? I built a $16.9 million company, successfully protected my assets from people who wanted to exploit them, and learned some valuable lessons about trust and family dynamics. That seems worth celebrating. What followed was the most unconventional and satisfying wedding reception in history. Instead of celebrating the union of two families, we celebrated the triumph of financial independence over financial manipulation. And the best part? Derek's family had to sit through the entire event, watching their gold-digging dreams crumble in real time. I made the announcement to our guests with a confidence I'd never felt before. Standing at the microphone where I was supposed to give my wedding speech, I delivered something completely different and infinitely more empowering. Thank you all for being here today to celebrate what was supposed to be Derek's and my wedding, I began, and I could see confused murmurs ripple through the crowd. Instead, we're going to celebrate something even more meaningful, the power of knowing your worth and protecting what you've earned. The room went silent as guests tried to process what was happening. In the front row, Patricia looked like she was going to be sick, while Robert was frantically whispering to other family members. Over the past few months, I've learned some valuable lessons about relationships, family dynamics, and the importance of financial independence. I've discovered that some people see success as an opportunity to benefit themselves, rather than something to celebrate and support. I could see my real friends in the audience starting to smile as they realized where this was going. They'd watched me struggle with Derek's family's increasingly aggressive behavior and had been hoping I'd find the strength to stand up for myself. So today, instead of promising to share my life with someone who saw my assets as our assets before we were even married, I'm making a different kind of commitment. I'm committing to building a life that reflects my values, my work ethic, and my vision for the future. The applause started slowly but built to a standing ovation from about half the room, specifically, the half that consisted of my friends, colleagues, and business associates. Derek's family and their friends remained seated, looking like they were attending a funeral rather than a celebration. But I wasn't done yet. I had prepared one final revelation that would complete the destruction of their financial ambitions and deliver the perfect poetic justice. I also want to share some exciting news about Vertulern's future, I announced, pulling out my phone to display a document I'd received that morning. This morning, I received a formal acquisition offer from Tech Global Industries for $23.7 million. The gasps from the audience were audible, but the sound that Patricia made was somewhere between a choke and a scream. They'd spent months trying to gain control of a company they thought was worth $16.9 million, only to discover that its actual value was nearly $7 million higher than they'd realized. I'll be carefully considering this offer with my legal and financial advisors, I continued, but it's gratifying to know that the company I built from nothing in my studio apartment is now being recognized as a major player in the industry. Derek was staring at me from the front row with an expression I'd never seen before, part regret, part respect, and part realization of what he'd lost by prioritizing his family's financial ambitions over our relationship. The reception that followed was surreal but amazing. My real friends treated it like the liberation party it actually was, celebrating my courage to walk away from a toxic situation and my success in building something incredible. Derek's family members gradually slipped away as the evening progressed, unable to stomach watching me celebrate the wealth they'd assumed would become theirs. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus, Derek's uncle who'd prepared all those worthless financial documents, approached me near the end of the evening. "Victoria, I owe you an apology," he said, looking genuinely ashamed. "The way my family approached your finances was inappropriate and presumptuous. You were smart to protect your assets, and you were right not to trust our intentions." "Thank you for saying that, Marcus. I hope Derek's family can learn from this experience. I think this was a wake-up call for all of us about the difference between supporting someone's success and trying to exploit it." As the evening wound down, I found myself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being rather than my net worth. My business partners were excited about the acquisition offer and proud of how I'd handled the family drama. My college friends were amazed at how much I'd accomplished and how confidently I'd defended my achievements. My employees, several of whom had attended the reception, were inspired by seeing their CEO refuse to compromise her vision for anyone. Derek approached me one final time as I was preparing to leave. "Vic, I know I messed this up completely, but I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built and how you handled everything. You deserved better than what my family and I put you through." "Thank you, Derek. I hope you can find someone who wants to build something together rather than assuming they deserve half of what you've already built." As I drove home that night, still in my wedding dress but wearing a smile instead of tears, I reflected on how perfectly everything had worked out. I'd avoided a marriage that would have been built on financial manipulation rather than mutual respect. I'd protected assets that represented years of sacrifice and hard work. I'd exposed people who'd pretended to care about me while actually caring about my money. And I'd celebrated my success with people who genuinely supported my achievements. The trust had saved my company, but the experience had saved something even more valuable, my understanding of my own worth and my willingness to defend it against anyone who tried to diminish it. 6 months after the most unconventional wedding reception in history, my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The acquisition offer from Tech Global Industries turned into a bidding war between 3 major tech companies, ultimately resulting in a final sale price of $28.2 million. Yes, you read that correctly. The company Derek's family tried to claim half of through marriage manipulation is now worth nearly double what they thought they were stealing. But the financial success, while gratifying, isn't even the best part of this story. The best part is discovering what real relationships look like when they're built on genuine respect rather than financial opportunity. The aftermath of my wedding day revelation had consequences that rippled through Derek's family for months. Patricia, who'd spent years positioning herself as a financial mastermind, became a social pariah in their circle when word spread about her failed attempt to manipulate her son's fiancé into signing over business assets. The story of the Notary ambush became legendary among their friends, but not in the way Patricia had hoped. Robert's business reputation suffered when potential clients learned about his involvement in the scheme. Apparently, people aren't eager to work with financial advisors who can't distinguish between legitimate planning and predatory manipulation. Several of his existing clients quietly moved their accounts to other firms, citing philosophical differences about professional ethics. Derek himself went through what his friends described as a quarter-life crisis after realizing how his family's greed had cost him a relationship with someone who'd built an empire from nothing. He eventually sent me a letter of apology that was surprisingly thoughtful and self-aware, acknowledging that he'd been raised to see other people's success as opportunities for his family rather than achievements to respect and support. But the most satisfying revenge came naturally, without any effort on my part. Derek's family had spent months telling everyone they knew about their son's upcoming marriage to a very successful businesswoman and dropping hints about the financial benefits this would bring to their family. When the wedding was cancelled and the truth about their manipulation attempts became public, they had to face the social consequences of being exposed as gold diggers. The acquisition of Vertulearn opened doors I'd never expected. I was invited to speak at major business conferences about entrepreneurship and financial independence. Harvard Business School asked me to guest lecture about protecting assets and recognizing manipulation in professional relationships. 3 different publishers reached out about writing a book on building wealth while maintaining personal integrity. Most importantly, I started a foundation focused on helping young entrepreneurs, especially women, understand their legal and financial rights when building businesses. Too many brilliant people get taken advantage of by family members, romantic partners, or business associates who see success as something to exploit rather than celebrate. The Foundation's first major initiative was creating educational resources about asset protection, trust formation, and recognizing financial manipulation in personal relationships. We've already helped dozens of entrepreneurs protect their companies from predatory family members and manipulative partners who assumed that love or marriage entitled them to ownership of independently built wealth. I also discovered something wonderful about the employees at Vertulearn. When I announced the acquisition and explained what had happened with Derek's family, my team was incredibly supportive and protective. Several employees mentioned that they'd been concerned about Derek's increasing involvement in business discussions and were relieved that I'd maintained control of the company's direction. "We were worried that your personal relationship might compromise the company culture we'd all worked to build," my lead developer told me. "Seeing you prioritize the business and stand up to that kind of pressure made us even more confident in your leadership." The trust structure that had originally been designed to protect my assets from one specific threat has now become a model for other entrepreneurs facing similar challenges. My lawyer has used the framework we developed to help dozens of other business owners protect their companies from family manipulation, romantic partner exploitation, and various other forms of financial predation. But perhaps the most unexpected benefit of this experience has been the clarity it's given me about what I actually want in a relationship. I'm not looking for someone who sees my success as their opportunity or who assumes that love entitles them to ownership of what I built. I'm looking for someone who has their own ambitions, their own achievements, and their own sense of financial responsibility. I'm currently dating someone I met through the entrepreneurship conference circuit, another business owner who built his company from the ground up and completely understands the importance of maintaining individual financial identity even within committed relationships. We celebrate each other's successes without assuming ownership of them, and we support each other's goals without trying to control each other's resources. The contrast with Derek's family's approach couldn't be more stark. Real partnership means encouraging each other's independence and success, not scheming to gain control of it. As I'm writing this story, I'm sitting in my new office, a beautiful space in a building I purchased with the proceeds from the Vertulearn acquisition. On my desk is a framed copy of the trust documents that saved my entire future, and next to it is a photo from my wedding reception showing me surrounded by people who genuinely care about my well-being rather than my net worth. The irony of the situation still makes me smile. Derek's family spent months planning elaborate schemes to gain control of $16.9 million, only to discover that the assets were legally protected and actually worth $28.2 million. They ended up with nothing except a reputation for financial manipulation and the social consequences of being exposed as gold diggers. Meanwhile, I ended up with complete financial freedom, a successful business exit, a foundation that's helping other entrepreneurs, and the most valuable lesson of my life: always trust your instincts when someone's interest in your success feels more acquisitive than supportive. The best revenge really is living well, But sometimes it's also making sure that people who try to exploit your success face appropriate consequences for their actions. So here's my question for all of you. Have you ever had family members or romantic partners who seemed more interested in your money than your well-being? How did you handle discovering that someone's love came with financial expectations? Do you think I was too harsh in exposing Derek's family's manipulation, or did they get exactly what they deserved? I love hearing your stories about standing up to financial predators and protecting what you've worked hard to build. Drop your experiences in the comments below, whether it's family members who assumed your success belonged to them, partners who felt entitled to your assets, or friends who tried to guilt you into funding their lifestyles. If this story inspired you to think about protecting your own financial independence, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about building wealth, recognizing manipulation, and delivering justice to people who think other people's success is their opportunity. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt pressured to give family members or romantic partners access to money they didn't earn. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect both your assets and your relationships from the corrosive effects of financial exploitation. Thank you for watching my story, and remember, you don't owe anyone access to what you've built, regardless of their relationship to you or their assumptions about what love and family should entitle them to. Your success is yours to protect, yours to enjoy, and yours to share with people who celebrate it rather than trying to claim it. Here's to building empires, protecting what we've earned, and surrounding ourselves with people who love us for who we are rather than what we have. Until next time, keep standing up for yourselves and never let anyone convince you that their feelings of entitlement override your right to financial independence.